It was Emily Carter's first day at Montgomery Technologies, and anxiety gripped her chest. After months of sending out resumes, she had finally landed the long-awaited administrative assistant position at one of the most renowned companies in the technology industry. However, what she didn't expect was that her first day would become unforgettable, for completely unexpected reasons. Upon arriving at the company's imposing building, she was greeted by an atmosphere of formality and efficiency. The sound of computer keys and the murmurs of corporate discussions filled the air. Emily, in her silk blouse and discreetly elegant midi skirt, felt a little out of place among so many experienced professionals. Her mind was focused solely on learning and, above all, on not making any mistakes. Throughout the day, she was introduced to several team members and briefed on the tasks she needed to perform. Everything was going well until, while hurrying through the entrance hall to a meeting with her supervisor, she disastrously bumped into a tall, imposing man. The next instant, Emily found herself falling into his lap. Her eyes wide with surprise, she stood up quickly, blushing. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened, she said, unsure whether to apologize or run away to hide. The man looked at her with a subtle smile, his green eyes gleaming in an almost enigmatic way. He seemed more amused than bothered, which disconcerted her even more. "Don't worry, Miss Carter," he said in a deep, confident voice, which made her jump slightly in surprise when she realized he knew her name. "It seems the first day is always full of surprises. James Montgomery, CEO of the company." She swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise in her face. The CEO, the man behind the entire operation, was right there, looking at her with a curiosity Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. "I didn't know you were in the building," was all she managed to articulate, her mind in a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. "And I also didn't know we'd have such a dramatic collision on our very first date." His smile grew subtly, leaving her even more disconcerted. Before she could say anything more, he gracefully stood up, leaving her confused and slightly nervous. It was clear that this wouldn't be a simple introduction to the job for Emily. Something had changed there, but what exactly was yet to be revealed. In the days following the incident of the first day, Emily began to realize that her far from casual encounter with James Montgomery was far from a mere coincidence of fate. With each step through the corridors of Montgomery Technologies, she felt the weight of his presence. He was everywhere, in every important meeting, in the decisions that shaped the company, even in the small changes that arose in the tasks assigned to her. Emily's routine quickly stabilized within the enormous technology company. She began working directly with her supervisor, Mark, a friendly man, but one who always seemed too rushed to pay much attention to detail. However, it was impossible not to notice James's constant interactions with senior executives and key employees. He moved with unwavering confidence, always with a sharp smile and calculated words, but never overly warm. When Emily needed to deliver some documents to James's floor, she felt a tension in the air. She knew he had been watching her closely for the past few days, and the memory of their first meeting, or their first disaster, as she preferred to think of it, still made her blush. Even so, she decided not to let it affect her. "Good morning, Miss Carter," James greeted her as she entered his office to deliver the reports. He sat behind an imposing glass desk, staring at a contract on his computer screen. His tone was soft, yet somehow challenging, as if he knew she reminded him of something. Or perhaps he liked it. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery." Emily made an effort to maintain her professional demeanor, even with the feeling of being closely observed. She placed the papers on the table and turned to leave, but something in her chest made her hesitate. "Mr. Montgomery, about the incident. I wanted to apologize again," she said, her voice almost inaudible. She hated being seen as clumsy, but she couldn't help feeling that way every time she remembered falling into his lap. James watched her intently, a slightly amused smile forming on his lips. "Emily, there's no need for apologies. I should be thanking you, actually. Your first day at the company, and you've already made me curious about what else life has in store for me." He spoke these words in such a disconcerting way that Emily didn't know how to react. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was something more in that look, an intensity she couldn't identify. She didn't know if he was speaking politely or if there was something more behind that smile, and that troubled her more than any other aspect of her new job. Over the following weeks, Emily had no choice but to get used to James's constant presence, both in the office and at informal meetings. He had an almost supernatural ability to always be in the right place at the right time, observing with an attention she couldn't ignore. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of his gaze on her, and even more disconcerting was the fact that on some level she knew he was genuinely interested. But what exactly did that mean? She didn't know. In her conversations with Mark and other colleagues, Emily noticed something peculiar about James. Everyone saw him as the absolute leader, the visionary who had transformed the Montgomery Technologies at one of the world's largest technology companies. But for Emily, the vision seemed more complex. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the distance he maintained from everyone around him, as if he were always searching for something more that he couldn't find within the walls of that company. He seemed like a man who, although surrounded by success and power, was trapped by something that no one else understood. On a particularly busy afternoon, Emily was called to a last-minute meeting in James's office. The anticipation in the air was palpable, and she sensed that this time it wouldn't just be another task. Something bigger was about to happen. As she entered the room, James was more focused than ever, but something in the way he looked at her made her feel a slight unease. "Emily, I need you to review this report before it moves to the next phase. It's an important project, and I trust your opinion." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the view of Manhattan. His posture was determined, but there was something vulnerable in his expression. Of course, sir. I'll start immediately," she replied, surprised by the request. This seemed more like a test than a simple review task. "I believe in your potential, Emily. What do you think of this project? It's something that could really change how we deal with technology in the future," he asked without turning to her, as if he were just throwing the question out there. She hesitated, observing the data on the computer screen. This was more than just a simple review of numbers. It was a question about the direction of the company, about their future. It was the first time he had opened up like this, without his usual enigmatic smile and aloofness. Emily didn't know how to answer. What did he want from her? What did he see in her? And more importantly, what was she herself beginning to feel for him? In the following days, Emily couldn't help but wonder if the trust James placed in her was genuine or just a way to test her abilities. He continued to ask for her opinion on important projects, her presence always constant at his meetings. His behavior was changing. Once again, she felt the weight of his gaze, but now there was something more, a tension she couldn't understand. On a particularly muggy June morning, Emily was called to a meeting with James again. This time, however, she noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. He was more serious, his face impassive as he stared at his computer screens. She knew something was about to happen. "Emily, I need you to make a decision about the next step in this project," James said without looking at her. "I trust your vision, but I want you to know that, depending on your choice, the direction of the company could change drastically." She swallowed hard. James's words were unusual. He had never pressured her like this before, always giving the impression that he was in complete control, that he already knew what to do. But now he seemed vulnerable, perhaps more so than she had imagined. I don't understand. What exactly do you want me to do?" Emily asked, fear gripping her. She wasn't prepared for decisions of such responsibility. She was there to learn, not to take the company's fate into her own hands. James looked at her with a calculated glint in his eyes. I want you to come up with a creative solution for the launch of this new product, something that could change everything. Or something that could destroy it. You're the only person who can do it right now." The pressure was overwhelming. Emily felt the weight of James's words like a burden on her shoulders. He believed in her, but he was also placing an immense responsibility on her, and however much she tried to rationalize it, something about the way he said it bothered her. She knew this was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to show she was ready for more than just being an assistant. But at the same time, the fear of making mistakes and not meeting James's expectations consumed her. It wasn't just a project now, it was something much bigger. Her future, her own position within that company, and perhaps even the future of her relationship with him. As she tried to organize her thoughts, a call broke the silence in the room. James answered quickly, his tone professional, but something in his expression made Emily realize that this was no simple business conversation. "No, we can't allow that. Not now," James said, clearly tense. He paused as if processing the information. "I understand. We'll do what's necessary. Thank you." When she hung up the phone, Emily noticed how shaken he seemed. "Is something wrong?" she asked before she could think of anything else. James hesitated for a moment before finally replying with an expression that mixed anger and frustration. "There's something happening in the market that threatens everything we've built. If we don't do something fast, everything we've created could crumble." Emily remained silent. She knew the tech market was volatile, but she never imagined James's company was on the verge of collapse. The company was not only the center of James's life, but also one of the world's largest tech powerhouses. A crisis of this magnitude could change everything, for him and for everyone around him. As he sat back down at his desk, his eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if he already saw the imminent fall of his empire. Emily couldn't help but feel responsible. That pressure, which was already great, now seemed unbearable. But there was one more thing she couldn't ignore. Each day, the line between professionalism and something more was becoming more blurred. She was beginning to see a vulnerability in James that he had never shown before. At first he was just a cold and calculating man, but now he was revealing himself as someone who also had his insecurities, his flaws. Something about her made him question his own invulnerability. "James, I don't know what to do. I can't carry this alone," she said, her voice lower than she had anticipated. He looked at her then, his eyes shining with an intensity she had never seen before. For a brief moment, it seemed as if time had stood still. His words, normally sharp and controlled, were now imbued with something more personal, something that related directly to her. "You're not alone, Emily, not anymore," he said, with a confidence she didn't know whether to find comforting or frightening. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the conflict within her intensify with each passing minute. She was being pulled into something she perhaps didn't know how to handle. A world of power, difficult decisions, and an attraction she didn't know how to control. As the days went by, the scene in Montgomery Technologies, things were becoming increasingly tense. Emily couldn't escape the mounting pressure, both within and outside her own heart. James's expectations were clear. He believed in her, perhaps more than she believed in herself. But what unsettled her most was what was happening between them, a silent attraction that grew with each interaction. Although she tried to keep her distance, something between them was beginning to crumble the professional and emotional barriers she had carefully built. Meanwhile, at home, Emily faced the reality of a past she preferred to forget. She lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Manhattan, far from James's luxurious and controlled life. Her work at Montgomery Technologies, it was, by far, the opportunity she had always dreamed of, but personal and family difficulties still plagued her. Her mother, who lived in a small town, never approved of Emily's choices, always insisting that she return and live more simply. This created additional pressure, as Emily felt she had something to prove, not only to her mother but also to herself. But what weighed most heavily on her at the moment was her relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Alex. Although the relationship had ended months before, he still maintained a constant presence in her life. They had separated due to distance and Alex's growing disinterest in his own career, something Emily never managed to accept, but even so, he continued to text and call, trying to reconnect with her. On a particularly stressful day, when work in Montgomery Technologies, it seemed to overwhelm her mind, but Emily received a message from Alex. Alex: "Hey, Emily. I know things ended badly, but I miss you. Can we talk? I want to understand what went wrong." She stared at the message for a long time, her fingers on the phone screen. Something inside her told her to ignore it, to move on, but at the same time she felt a wave of nostalgia and doubt. What did she really want? She was ready for a new chapter in her life, but Alex's words seemed to cast shadows over her new beginning. It was hard to deny that he still held a place in her heart. That same day, while Emily was trying to process her conflicting feelings, a new twist occurred at the company. James, who until then had maintained an unwavering leadership posture, found himself embroiled in a financial scandal involving one of his trusted executives. He was being pressured by investors and the media, who were questioning his decisions and the direction of the company. In an emergency meeting with the executive team, the tension was palpable. James, who normally remained calm in any situation, was visibly affected. He was faced with a difficult choice: to make concessions in his strategic plan or to stand firm, knowing that this could cost him the trust of the shareholders and possibly control of the company. Emily, who was attending the meeting as an assistant, felt a pang of empathy for James. He was torn between what the company needed and what he believed was the right path for the future. But what intrigued her most was the feeling that, in that moment of crisis, he felt more vulnerable than ever. He was facing a dilemma that could define the future of his career, and somehow she knew that her own trajectory was also tied to these decisions. When the meeting ended, Emily stayed behind, organizing the documents that needed to be sent to the investors. That's when James approached her, a tense look on his face. "Emily," he began, his voice low and deep, "I know this isn't part of your job, but I need your opinion. We're on the verge of a crisis and I can't do this alone." She looked at him, unsure what to say. On one hand, the pressure was immense. She knew her answer could influence the course of everything. But on the other hand, James's request seemed more personal than ever, as if he were somehow revealing his weaknesses to her. I don't know what to say, James, but maybe it's time to look at what really matters. If you make a decision that doesn't align your values with the company, everyone will feel it. You can't win everything all the time," she said, her words more sincere than she had imagined. James watched her for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. Finally, he took a deep breath. "You're right. Maybe I got lost in the middle of all this. Thank you, Emily. I knew I could count on you." But what Emily didn't know was that this conversation would trigger a series of events that would change not only the dynamic between them, but also the future of the company and Emily herself. James was now on the verge of a choice that could define his destiny, and somehow she was at the center of that decision. As she left the room, Emily couldn't help but feel she was being pulled into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. James's dilemma, the financial scandal, and her own emotional turmoil were dangerously intertwined. She knew that sooner or later she would have to make a choice, not just about her career, but about where her heart truly belonged. The day had begun like any other, with Emily focused on small daily tasks and trying to cope with the pressures of work. However, the atmosphere at Montgomery Technologies, things were about to change dramatically. The financial crisis that had hit the company was beginning to take on unexpected proportions, and tensions between executives were more visible than ever. Emily was in the middle of an important meeting with her supervisor, Mark, when she received an unexpected message from James Montgomery. "I need to speak with you. You can't wait. Room 314, 5 minutes." The urgent tone of the message sent a chill down her spine. She knew James was facing a storm of problems, but she never imagined his request would be related to what was about to happen. She quickly apologized to Mark and went to the indicated room. Her heart pounded as she walked down the corridors, feeling a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. When she entered room 314, James was standing there looking out the window, a tense expression on his face. He seemed more serious than ever, and for the first time, Emily noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. "Close the door, please," he asked without turning around, his voice deep. She obeyed, feeling the pressure mount. "What happened, James?" she asked, trying to remain calm, but the fear she felt was palpable. James took a deep breath and finally turned to her. He seemed to be struggling with something internal, but when he spoke, his words were direct. "Emily, we have a big problem. The financial scandal, it's more serious than we imagined, but what nobody knows yet is that I'm being personally investigated. Investors are questioning my decisions, and there are rumors of fraud. If I don't act fast, the company will collapse, and I could lose everything." James's words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She already knew the situation was critical, but she never imagined that James himself was so deeply involved in the crisis. He was now in a vulnerable position, and the pressure on him was immense. "But you can't be serious," Emily said, her voice trembling. "You're the CEO. This can't be true." James approached her, his eyes fixed intensely on hers. "I know, Emily, I didn't want you to know this. But you have to understand, everything I've done so far, every choice I've made, has been to keep the company afloat. I believed I was doing the right thing, but now everything is falling apart." Emily remained silent, her brain trying to process everything he had just revealed. She didn't know what to say. James, the man she thought was unshakable, was standing there before her, vulnerable and desperate. It was impossible to ignore the pain in his eyes. "And what are you going to do?" she finally asked, her voice low. "I need a quick solution. If I can't convince the investors that I'm capable of turning this around, I'll have no choice but to leave the company," he replied, his voice heavy with a weight Emily had never imagined. But there was more. She sensed, unintentionally, that there was something else. James was hiding something he didn't want to tell her, and that's what made her feel even more insecure. She knew he was going through a fragile time, but she also knew he was protecting a secret, and perhaps that secret could change everything between them. She looked at him, feeling the conflict growing inside her. The attraction she felt for James was now mixed with a growing fear. If he really was at the center of this crisis, what did that mean for her? And more, what did that mean for their relationship? "James, I need to know the truth. What else are you not telling me?" Emily asked, feeling the tension rising. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, she could no longer ignore what was happening between them. James seemed to hesitate, as if the words weighed heavily in his throat. He finally spoke, his voice low but firm. I don't know how you'll react to this, Emily. I've been involved in shady dealings in the past. Some decisions I made may have been wrong, but I can no longer deny that everything is coming to light now. I'm not the man you thought I was." Those words landed like a bomb. Emily stared at him, stunned. Everything she knew about James was being called into question. He wasn't the man she thought he was. He was distant, broken, and somehow lost. I can't believe what I'm hearing," Emily murmured, her mind in shock. "Are you telling me that the crisis we're facing is your fault?" "It's not that simple," James said, frustration evident in his voice. "I made difficult choices, Emily, I did things I thought were necessary for the company's survival, but now I'm starting to realize that maybe I went too far, and maybe in the end I put us all at risk. I know I involved you in this, and maybe you're wondering what to do, but the truth is, now, the choices are yours too." James's words echoed in Emily's mind. She was in the midst of a storm of uncertainty, and the choices she made now could alter the course of her life and her relationship with him. She looked at him, knowing the decision was in her hands. Doubt, fear, and attraction were intertwined in her heart, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere were absorbing the tension between them. Emily hardly knew what to make of James's revelations. He had shown himself to be vulnerable in a way she had never imagined, and now the magnitude of his words left her breathless. What she knew about him was far more complex than she could ever have imagined. He wasn't just the CEO of a large company. He was a man with secrets, with difficult choices, and with a past that might never be fully redeemed. The silence between the two stretched on, with Emily trying to process everything she had just heard. She looked at James, trying to understand what this meant for her, for him, and for the future of their relationship. He seemed even more distant than ever, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the walls of the office. "James, this changes everything," Emily said finally, her voice firm but heavy with deep sadness. "I don't know what you expect of me after all this. I don't know if I'm capable of continuing in this game." James watched her, his eyes filled with regret. He knew he had dragged Emily into dangerous territory. The decisions he had made hadn't just affected his own life. Now he had involved her in something that could destroy her career as well. And their relationship? He no longer knew what it represented. He knew she was being pulled into an abyss from which she didn't know if she could escape. "I didn't want to drag you into this, Emily. I never wanted you to be a part of this. But now if you decide to leave, I understand. I can't force you to stay anymore. You have every right to want distance from me and from all of this," James said, with a raw sincerity that made Emily's heart clench. She knew he was suffering, but she also knew she couldn't make the decisions for him. But Emily was torn. She still believed that he, on some level, was the man she cared about. She felt a connection with him that she couldn't simply ignore. However, what she couldn't ignore were the risks of getting involved with a man like James, someone who was at the center of a financial scandal and whose past choices still hung over him like a shadow. I need some time to think, James," Emily said, feeling the weight of the decision in her words. "I can't make a decision right now. I don't know what I should do." James closed his eyes as if he had expected that answer. "I understand. I don't know what to do with all this anymore. I involved you in something that wasn't fair to you." But before he could say more, the door to the room opened abruptly. Mark, Emily's supervisor, entered without knocking, his expression tense and worried. What he had to say seemed urgent, and Emily's focus immediately shifted. "James, Emily," Mark said quickly, "we just received notification of a data breach. Investors are pressing for an explanation, and the media is already starting to ask questions. The crisis has just escalated. We need to act fast." James stood up, his face now completely serious, with no trace of the vulnerability he had shown before. He was back in his role as leader, ready to face the battle that was approaching. "Get ready. We can't let this get out of control. Emily, you stay with me. Now more than ever, we need a quick response." Emily looked at him, surprised by the sudden transformation. It was as if, when confronted with the impending crisis, James had reverted to the man everyone knew. The ruthless CEO, the driving force behind the Montgomery Technologies. But inside she felt a growing unease. She no longer knew if the decision to stay by his side was the right one, or if she was simply allowing herself to be swallowed up by something she couldn't control. She turned to Mark, who was watching the interaction with a worried expression. He knew the situation and certainly felt the weight of the choices being made. How should she act now? What, in fact, did she expect from the situation she found herself in? "I'll stay, James, but I need clear answers. I don't know where we're going with all this anymore," Emily said, her voice determined but still heavy within a doubt. "I'm not going to stay in the dark." James nodded, his eyes now steady. "I understand. We'll work this out, Emily. I promise." As he turned to focus on the impending crisis, Emily felt a mixture of anger and understanding. She knew he was fighting to save everything he had built, but the truth was that his own choices now affected not only his life, but hers as well. She was immersed in a web of decisions she couldn't undo, and now, more than ever, she needed to take control of her own destiny. But deep down, she also knew, as long as James was by her side, she wouldn't be able to escape this storm, and for some reason, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. The crisis in Montgomery Technologies, things were escalating alarmingly. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, containment strategies, and desperate attempts to regain control of the situation. But for Emily, the real battle was being fought within herself. She could no longer ignore the reality of her position. The job, which at first seemed like a great opportunity, had now become a tight web of expectations and pressures that she no longer knew how to handle. James was immersed in executive decisions, and although she remained by his side, she felt she was drifting further and further away from the woman who had entered the company, full of dreams and confidence. During the long nights at the office, Emily found herself reflecting on the choices she had made so far. Her relationship with James was at a breaking point. She knew he was trying to resolve the crisis, but there was something about his leadership that bothered her. He made cold, impersonal decisions without thinking about the long-term consequences, and this made her question everything she believed to be right. It was during a particularly difficult night, when James was more distant than ever, that Emily decided she needed to change. She could no longer depend on him or the system he had created to find her own identity. She needed to find herself again, without James's shadow looming over her. She began to take control of the situation. During a meeting with investors, she used her strategic vision to suggest a completely new approach for the company. The crisis, she argued, could not be resolved with traditional measures alone. She suggested that the company revise its internal and external communication structure, investing in transparency with customers and offering a new product capable of attracting the attention of the media and consumers. It was a risky idea, but something inside her made her believe it was the only viable path. She knew that if Montgomery Technologies, if he were to move forward, he would have to abandon some of his old and risky strategies. Investors were surprised by the boldness of his suggestions, but ultimately agreed to give his proposal a chance. James, who had been watching from afar, couldn't hide his surprise at seeing Emily's confidence in the room. She was finally showing the leadership he knew she possessed, but which he had never known how to encourage. He who had always believed he had total control saw that he was losing some of that control, and on a deeper level, perhaps he was beginning to lose control over Emily as well. She, in turn, felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: empowerment. She had done something on her own, without depending on James's approval or anyone else's. The feeling of freedom she felt when proposing that change was indescribable. She knew that by taking a firmer stance, she was changing her own trajectory, not just the company's. In the following days, Emily continued to work tirelessly to implement her vision for the company, growing ever more confident and assertive. She made tough decisions and, for the first time, allowed herself to be seen as more than just James's assistant. She was shaping herself into a leader, someone who could, in fact, forge her own path without depending on the failures or successes of another person. However, as she progressed, she also found herself confronted with a difficult decision. her relationship with James. The distance between them widened each day, not because of the crisis, but because of the choices they were both making. James, with his rigid vision and focus on impersonal decisions, was emotionally distancing himself from everything and everyone. He was increasingly concerned with his own survival in Montgomery Technologies, and less concerned with the feelings of others. The attraction between them was becoming a difficult issue to deal with. What Emily felt for him was more complex than she had ever imagined, but she knew she needed to grow, and to do that, she needed to move away from this emotional dependence. On a hot July afternoon, Emily decided to have an honest conversation with James. She knew he was worried about the company, but she also knew she needed to clear things up between them. Room 314, where so many conversations had taken place, now seemed like a distant place, as if the walls had witnessed something that could no longer be ignored. "James," she began, her voice firm but with a hint of hesitation, "we need to talk about everything." He looked up from the financial report he was reviewing and observed her with an expression he tried to hide, but which betrayed his concern. "About what, Emily? About us? About what we're doing here? I need to know what this means. I can't continue down this path without knowing where we're going," she said, feeling the weight of her own words. James stood up and walked to the window, his gaze lost on the horizon. "I don't know, Emily. I know how much I've involved you in this, but the truth is that everything I've done so far has been to try and save the company, and you've been an important part of it. But at the same time, I don't know how to go on. I've lost myself in all of this. I don't know what you expect from me anymore." She remained silent for a moment, pondering her own emotions. What did she truly want? She wanted to grow, to achieve her own goals, but she also wanted someone with whom she could share the journey. However, she could no longer rely on James to define who she was. "I don't know what you want, James, but I know what I want. I want to play my part in this process, but I also need to follow my own path. I can no longer live in the shadow of your decisions." He looked at her with a sad expression, but also a kind of acceptance. "I understand. Maybe you're right. Maybe the time has come for you to fly on your own." Emily took a deep breath. She knew this conversation, though painful, was necessary. She needed to step out of James's shadow to become who she truly wanted to be. Emily's decision to distance herself from James and follow her own path wasn't easy, but she knew it was necessary. Over the following weeks, she focused on her proposal to the Montgomery Technologies. She worked tirelessly to implement it. The pressure to save the company was mounting, but now, with a new perspective, she felt she was in control of her own journey. James, on the other hand, seemed more distant than ever. Although she continued to see him daily, he was increasingly absorbed in the demands of the financial crisis, dealing with investors and trying to turn the company around. What surprised her most was how he was handling it all, silently, isolated, and without making room for those around him. The facade of an unbeatable CEO was beginning to crack, and Emily couldn't help but notice that he was losing himself more each day. The impact of the decisions she had made was reflected throughout the corporate environment. Investors, initially skeptical, began to be impressed by Emily's determination and focus. She was no longer just James's assistant. She was becoming a central figure in the company's restructuring. Her proposal was being accepted, and the initial market reactions were positive, but the real test was yet to come. One morning, Emily received an urgent message from Mark. "Mark, Emily, we have a meeting with investors at 2 p.m. James asked you to attend. He wants to discuss your proposal in detail. Be prepared for the tough questions." She knew this would be the moment of truth. Everything she had done so far, every step she had taken to restore the company and her own autonomy, depended on this meeting. It was now or never. The weight of responsibility on her shoulders was immense, but at the same time, she felt a growing adrenaline rush. She was about to live the moment she had dreamed of since she joined the company, Montgomery Technologies. In the meeting room, the air was thick with the presence of the investors, all watching his every move. James stood at the head of the table, his expression tense. When Emily entered, he glanced at her for a brief moment, as if her presence reminded him of everything he had been trying to avoid. "Emily, thank you for being here. You have something important to present," James said, his voice colder than usual. She nodded, feeling the investor's gaze weighing on her. With newfound confidence, she began to present her proposal. She spoke clearly, explaining how restructuring the business model, focused on transparency and innovation, could not only save the company, Montgomery Technologies, but also to reposition the brand in the global market. Her eyes shone as she spoke, her passion for the solution evident, but as she knew, investors were not easily impressed. The first to speak was one of the most influential shareholders, a man with a stern expression and an implacable voice. "Emily," he began, his voice thick with skepticism, "you're suggesting we abandon the aggressive approach James implemented and take such a big risk. What guarantees that this will work? And more importantly, how can we trust that you're really in control of this situation?" The atmosphere grew tense. Everyone's eyes were fixed on her, awaiting her response. Emily could feel the weight of the responsibility, but she didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what to say. "I understand the concern. But what we have today isn't working. If we continue with the same model, we will continue to sink. My proposal isn't just about changing what already exists, but about creating something new, closer to the needs of the current market. The confidence you have in James cannot be the only reason to maintain the status quo. We need to be bolder. We need to be visionary." The investors fell silent, analyzing her words. She could see the internal struggle on their faces, the doubt and the desire to bet on something new. But the real challenge was yet to come. James's reaction. He had remained silent until that moment, observing Emily with an enigmatic gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded lower but with undeniable weight. "The stakes are high. There's no denying that. But maybe Emily is right. We need something different. We're at a turning point, and I can't keep ignoring reality." James's words caused absolute silence in the room. The investors exchanged glances, surprised by the change in James's tone. Was he giving in? Was he beginning to trust Emily? Or was there something else at stake, something he hadn't yet revealed? "So, we're in agreement?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. James looked at her for a long moment, his eyes piercing hers, as if trying to read her intentions. For a brief instant he seemed vulnerable again, and Emily realized that perhaps he was as lost as she was in this whole process. "We are. But Emily, understand one thing. What you're proposing isn't just a risk for the company. It's a risk for all of us," he said, his voice serious. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words, but for the first time she didn't feel intimidated. She was in control now. She had a role to play, and nothing would stop her anymore. As the meeting progressed, the pieces began to fall into place. Emily's proposal was accepted, but with several conditions. A clear sign that the journey to save the Montgomery Technologies, it wasn't complete yet. However, the confidence she had gained at that moment was an undeniable victory. As the meeting drew to a close, James approached her. He seemed calmer, but the tension in his eyes still lingered. "You did well, Emily, but we still have a lot of work ahead of us." "I know," she replied with a calm smile, "but now it's our turn to do things our way." The tension in the air was palpable when the Montgomery Technologies, it was preparing for the event that would decide its future. After weeks of uncertainty, negotiations, and attempts to reverse the crisis, the final moment had arrived. The market was anxiously waiting to see if the company would survive or become just another failure in the history of large corporations. Emily and James were more distant than ever, and the situation was about to explode. But now, it wasn't just the future of the company that was at stake. It was their future as well. The night before the results presentation was tense. James was in his office reviewing the final details of his presentation. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming him. He knew that his past failure could be the end for the Montgomery Technologies, and with that, her own career. Emily, on the other hand, was in a hotel, reviewing the numbers and details of the proposal she had made. Although her confidence had grown, she knew that the next day would be the final test. On the morning of the big event, the two were ready. The auditorium was packed with investors, journalists, and executives who were anxiously awaiting the leaders' speeches. Montgomery Technologies' Emily's team was lined up and ready, their eyes tense but determined. James stepped onto the stage first, his imposing presence dominating the room. He looked like the man everyone knew, the CEO who had led the company to that point of crisis. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't the same as before. There was something different about it, a vulnerability he had never shown before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a little hoarse but firm, "we are here to discuss the future of Montgomery Technologies. Many of you know that we are in a time of crisis. The company you all know cannot continue as before. I made mistakes. I made wrong decisions that brought us to this point. But what matters most now is what we do from here on out." He paused, his eyes fixed on the investors and journalists. For a moment, no one dared to interrupt. "The crisis we face is not just financial. It's a crisis of confidence, and I am responsible for that. I left the company in the hands of strategies that didn't work. But in my attempt to save the company, I have to keep it afloat. Montgomery Technologies. But I found something far more important. A leader who until now I hadn't recognized as I should have. Emily Wilson." Her name sounded like an explosion in the room. Everyone turned to Emily, who was sitting among the executives. She remained silent, her breath almost frozen as she listened to those words. James was finally acknowledging his role in the company's restructuring. But what did that mean for the two of them? "Emily has the vision and courage that Montgomery Technologies. She needs what she has right now. She has what it takes to get us out of this crisis and take the company to a new level of success. I, as CEO, will no longer be the leader of all this. The future of the company is now in her hands." The murmur in the room was instantaneous. All eyes were on Emily, who hadn't yet moved. She knew that this moment would define not only the future of the company, but her own future as well. She stood with an immense weight on her shoulders, each step she took toward the stage seeming to increase the tension in the air. But when she reached the center, her eyes met James's. He was there, behind her, with a complex expression, pride, pain, and something else she couldn't quite put her finger on. "Thank you, James," she began, her voice firm and clear. "I wasn't alone in this process. You were a part of it too, even if it was in a difficult and painful way. But now we need to look to the future." She turned to the audience and began to speak with the same passion that had guided her there. Every word that came out of her mouth was filled with confidence and clarity. She described how the Montgomery Technologies, it would not only restructure, but reinvent itself. The company could no longer be just about numbers and profit. It had to be about innovation, transparency, and a new vision for the market. But then, something unexpected happened. In the middle of his presentation, the auditorium doors burst open. A group of journalists rushed in, and murmurs grew louder. The CEO of a direct competitor of Redgate Inc., he was standing there, observing everything from afar. Emily James, the CEO of Redgate, he said, interrupting the presentation, his voice full of a defiant tone. Do you really think you can save this company with these empty changes? The crisis will swallow you whole. Montgomery Technologies, you will never be able to get up again, no matter what you try to do. I can guarantee that tomorrow Redgate, he'll be in the lead, taking what's left. The room fell into absolute silence. The provocation was clear and cruel. Emily, however, did not hesitate. She looked directly at the CEO of Redgate, and with the same confidence that had brought her there, she responded with a simple yet powerful statement. You may be right, but the Montgomery Technologies, it's not just a company. It's not about numbers. If you think you can take what's left, you're very mistaken. We're just getting started. The room erupted in applause. The atmosphere changed completely. The investors, who had been skeptical until then, began to get excited. Emily had established herself as a true leader, and not just on paper, but through the power of her words and actions. She turned her gaze to James, and he smiled, finally recognizing the transformation that had occurred within her. Their relationship now seemed different. No longer one of dependence, but of mutual respect. What began as a financial crisis was now turning into a personal victory for both of them. Montgomery Technologies, she was ready for a fresh start, and somehow they were ready for a fresh start too. Time passed quickly after Emily's big performance. The following weeks were full of changes, both for her and for the other woman. Montgomery Technologies, as well as for its leaders, the company began to see a gradual recovery, driven by the changes proposed by Emily, and investor confidence was restored. But the biggest change of all was not in the numbers or strategies, but in Emily herself, who had, in effect, become the new leader of the company. Gradually, James distanced himself from corporate life. Although he was still consulted on some matters, the company now operated under Emily's leadership, and he realized that his journey in Montgomery Technologies, it was coming to an end. He knew that his departure wasn't a defeat, but an acceptance that the company needed something new, and, more importantly, that he needed to find a new path for himself. At James's last meeting with the executives, he gave a brief but meaningful speech. I know many of you have doubts about the future of the company. I was responsible for getting us where we are, but I also know that Montgomery Technologies, it wouldn't be what it is without the people who are part of it. Emily, you surprised me. Not only with your ideas, but with your strength to make decisions that I couldn't make. You deserve to lead, and the company will be better for it. Emily, who listened attentively, couldn't hide a slight sadness in her eyes. She knew that, in a way, she was saying goodbye not only to a leader, but also to a long-time partner. However, she also knew that James's decision to step back was the moment for her to move forward, and she was no longer willing to hesitate. With James stepping away from corporate life, Emily definitively took his place as CEO. She was ready to lead the company. Montgomery Technologies in this new phase. He was also aware that the journey to ensure the company's lasting success was not yet over. Relationships within the company had changed, but the most significant transformation was in the relationship between Emily and James. Although they still shared mutual respect, they were now heading in different directions, and in a way, this set them free. Emily, now with a new perspective on life and work, decided to focus on her personal life as well. She was no longer willing to make personal sacrifices for corporate success. She knew that her professional growth should be accompanied by a balance with her own emotional and personal needs. For months, she and James maintained an open dialogue about their roles, sharing the challenges each faced in their new journeys. As Emily grew into leadership of the Montgomery Technologies, she also realized that she had much to learn about leadership outside the business world. She began to explore her own interests, dedicating herself to activities and friendships that had been neglected in the past. And while the future of Montgomery Technologies, as things looked increasingly promising, Emily knew that her true victory was finding her own path, both inside and outside of business. The crisis that had begun to put everything at risk was now transforming into a story of personal overcoming, something she could share with pride. James, for his part, also found a new path. He dedicated himself to a personal project he had always dreamed of, but never had time to pursue while obsessed with corporate success. Montgomery Technologies, it would no longer be his life, but he knew that, in some way, his legacy was still part of what the company had become. The sun was beginning to set over the city, and Emily was in her office, looking out the window. She felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. The path she had traveled hadn't been easy, but now she knew that each challenge, each obstacle, had shaped her in a unique way. She took a deep breath, feeling that the future was finally within her grasp, and despite all the difficulties she had faced, she knew she was ready for anything that came next. Months have passed since the big day when Emily took over the leadership of Montgomery Technologies. The company flourished under her leadership. Its profits soared, and confidence was restored. She had made her work her passion, but now she had found a balance. The pressure that once consumed her no longer dominated her as it once did. Emily had managed to turn the crisis into an opportunity, and in doing so, she had also transformed her personal life. James, for his part, was on a new project. Although the corporate world still called to him, he had decided to dedicate himself to a social cause that had touched him for years. He founded an NGO focused on the education of at-risk youth, something he had always had in mind, but never had the courage to do. And although the two would never work together again, Emily knew it had been important for him to find his new purpose, just as she had found hers. On a chilly autumn afternoon, Emily walked through the park near her apartment, contemplating the challenges that had shaped her journey. The gentle breeze caressed her face, and she felt that for the first time she was exactly where she needed to be. She stopped before a tree, admiring its golden leaves as they slowly fell. At that moment, she reflected on everything she had learned throughout this journey, about leadership, about trusting herself, about what truly mattered. On the horizon, she could see the buildings of Montgomery Technologies. In the distance, she now reflected a promising future, a future she herself had helped to build. But, more importantly, she knew that the company's success wasn't just about numbers or recognition. It was about the people behind it, people like her who had been challenged and had surpassed their own limits. The story of her transformation was far from over. What had begun as a crisis in the business world was now extending to something much deeper, a new vision of life and work. And deep down, she knew there was still much more to achieve. But for now, she was at peace, feeling the weight of the difficult days being replaced by the tranquility of the choices she had made. The journey had not been easy, but she had reached her destination, and she knew that wherever the future took her, she would have the strength to move forward. And you, what would you do if you were in Emily's place? What choices would you make when life, love, and career intersect in a storm of uncertainties? Emily's story is not just about overcoming challenges in the corporate world, but about discovering who we are when the weight of the world falls on our shoulders. Her journey reminds us that even in the most difficult moments, there is always an opportunity to start over. What matters is not giving up. Emily's story shows us that, with courage and determination, we can transform our lives and even the world around us. Now it's your turn to reflect. How have your own choices shaped who you are today? Share your thoughts and continue the conversation. Sometimes the hardest journey is the one that leads us to discover our true purpose.